times.uk.
Good afternoon to you. 25 minutes to 4 o'clock. It's Jane Garvey here on Times Radio. Fee Glover is off this week, but she'll be back next week. That means, though, that I get to do the podcast off air with no less a person than the associate editor of the Times magazine, Jane Mulcarins. She's always excellent value. I've already had a brief conversation with her earlier today. She just got back from New York because that's the kind of person she is. And she doesn't suffer from jet lag, she says, because she doesn't believe in it. And according to her, if you don't believe in something, you can't suffer from it. Well, we'll test that out when she joins me for off air, and you'll be able to hear that from 6 o'clock tonight on all good podcast platforms. As ever, some brilliant emails from you over the course of the weekend. We have in particular, over the last couple of weeks, been exploring the topic of grandparents and the lives led particularly by our grandmothers. In many, many cases, brilliant, gifted women who just didn't get the opportunities that the rest of us perhaps today take completely for granted. So there have been some brilliant stories. Keep them coming to Jane and Fee at times.radio. The Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, is about to come into the House of Commons, we are told, to give his statement on the Israel-Hamas conflict. He hasn't arrived just yet. When he does, I promise that we will take it live. We will also hear from the leader of the opposition, Sir Keir Starmer. Does look as though he is now in the Commons, Rishi Sunak. He's just strode in and has taken his seat on the front bench, but he isn't speaking at the moment. If you are a fan of reading, we've got a book club on off air, and our latest choice is something very interesting. I'm using the word, it's doing a lot of heavy lifting, the word interesting. It's called Boy Swallows Universe. It's by an Australian author called Trent Dalton, and it has been a huge success in Australia. It's been such a talking point. Many, many people love it. They think of it as life-changing. Other people are not entirely sure. I've got to page 19, and I still don't know what I think about it. But it's our book club choice, and if you want to read along with us, we'll do the book club podcast in a couple of weeks' time. So you have got time available to read Boy Swallows Universe by Trent Dalton. The idea of the off-air book club is to choose something that not necessarily divisive, but something that not everybody is going to agree on, and also something that isn't wildly popular currently in the UK. So that is this month's choice. Later in this week, I'm going to be talking to Ed Gamble, hit podcaster, and someone who's got a lot of very interesting things to say about food and his approach to food and how he's changed it. So Ed Gamble a bit later in the week. And also, I suppose not unconnected, although I suspect with a rather different relationship to food, the Hairy Bikers are joining me later in this week as well. They've got a new book out, and it does looks a goodie. And I'm a big fan of the Hairy Bikers, actually, so it'll be very nice to have them. I think they're coming into the studio, so I'll get to meet the Hairy Bikers. I'm hopeful. I'm gazing at, yes, they are coming in, so I will be able to get to meet them. So that's them booked in for later in the week here on Times Radio. And tomorrow, Kat Bohannon with that fascinating book called Eve, which is about the female physiology and how it has dictated the course of human evolution over the last 200 million years. Rishi Sunak is on his feet now in the House of Commons. Here is the Prime Minister. Oh, I don't think he is speaking, or is he? On one of my screens, he's speaking. Here's Lindsay Hoyle, who's the Speaker, about to introduce him.
This 14-year-old lad from my constituency has been passed from pillar to post in terms of schools. They just simply can't deal with his ADHD and autism. Would the Minister meet with me about this specific case?
I'd be delighted to meet with the Honourable Gentleman.
Right, that completes questions. We now come to the statement. I call the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak.
Mr. Speaker, last week I visited the Middle East, bringing a message of solidarity with the region against terror and against the further spread of conflict. I met with the leaders of Israel, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Egypt and the Palestinian Authority to coordinate our response to the crisis before us, but also to renew the better vision of the future that Hamas is trying to destroy. I travelled first to Israel. It is a nation in mourning. But, Mr. Speaker, it is also a nation under attack. The violence against Israel did not end on the 7th of October. Hundreds of rockets are launched at their towns and cities every day. And Hamas still holds around 200 hostages, including British citizens. In Jerusalem, I met some of the relatives who are suffering unbearable torment. Their pain will stay with me for the rest of my days. I'm doing everything in my power and working with all our partners to get their loved ones home. So in my meetings with Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Herzog, I told them once again that we stand resolutely with Israel in defending itself against terror. And I stressed again the need to act in line with international humanitarian law and take every possible step to avoid harming civilians. It was a message delivered by a close friend and ally. I say it again, we stand with Israel. Mr. Speaker, I recognise that the Palestinian people are suffering terribly. Over 4,000 Palestinians have been killed in this conflict. They are also the victims of Hamas, who embed themselves in the civilian population. Too many lives have already been lost, and the humanitarian crisis is growing. I went to the region to address these issues directly. In Riyadh, then Cairo, I met individually with Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman from Saudi Arabia, the Emir of Qatar, Sheikh Tamim bin Hamad Al Thani, President Sisi in Egypt, and President Abbas of the Palestinian Authority. These were further to my meetings with the King of Jordan last week and calls with other leaders, and my Right Honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary's extensive travel in the region. Mr. Speaker, there are three abiding messages from all of these conversations. The first is that we must continue working together to get more humanitarian support into Gaza. The whole House will welcome the limited opening of the Rafah crossing. It is important progress and testament to the power of diplomacy, but it is not enough. We need a constant stream of aid pouring in, bringing the water, food, medicine and fuel that is so desperately needed. So we will keep up the diplomatic pressure. We've already committed £10 million of extra support to help civilians in Gaza. And Mr. Speaker, I can announce today that we are going further. We are providing an additional £20 million of humanitarian aid to civilians in Gaza, more than doubling our previous support to the Palestinian people. There are major logistical and political challenges to delivering this aid, which I discussed with President Sisi. My Right Honourable friend, the Development Minister, is leading an effort to ensure the maximum amount of aid is pre-positioned with UK support ready to deliver. We're also working intensively to ensure that British nationals trapped in Gaza are able to leave through the Rafah crossing when it properly reopens. The second message, Mr. Speaker, is that this is not a time for hyperbole and simplistic solutions. It is a time for quiet and dogged diplomacy that recognises the hard realities on the ground and delivers help now. And we have an important role to play. In all of my meetings, people were clear that they value Britain's engagement. The UK's voice matters. We have deep ties across the region, ties of defence, trade and investment, but also of history. President Abbas pointed to that history, not the British mandate in Palestine or the Balfour Declaration, but the UK's efforts over decades to support the two-state solution. And that brings me to my third point, Mr. Speaker. Growing attacks by Hezbollah on Israel's northern border, rising tensions on the West Bank, and missiles and drones launched from Yemen show that some are seeking escalation. So we need to invest more deeply in regional stability and in the two-state solution. Last night I spoke to the leaders of the United States, Germany, France, Italy and Canada. We are all determined to prevent escalation. That's why I'm deploying RAF and Royal Navy assets, monitoring threats to regional security and supporting humanitarian efforts. Mr. Speaker, our support for a two-state solution is highly valued across the region. But it can't just be a cliched talking point to roll out at times like this. The truth is that in recent years, energy has moved into other avenues like the Abraham Accords and normalisation talks with Saudi Arabia. We support those steps, absolutely, and believe that they can bolster wider efforts. but we must never lose sight of how essential the two-state solution is. So we'll work together with our international partners to bring renewed energy and creativity to this effort. It will rely on establishing more effective governance for Palestinian territories in Gaza and the West Bank. It will also mean challenging actions that undercut legitimate aspirations for Palestinian statehood. Mr. Speaker, Hamas care more about their paymasters in Iran than the children they hide behind. So let me be clear. There is no scenario where Hamas can be allowed to control Gaza or any part of the Palestinian territories. Hamas is not only a threat to Israel, but to many others across the region. All the leaders I met agree that this is a watershed moment. It's time to set the region on a better path. Mr. Speaker, I also want to say a word about the tone of the debate. When things are so delicate, we all have a responsibility to take additional care in the language we use and to operate on the basis of facts alone. The reaction to the horrific explosion at the Al Ahli Arab Hospital was a case in point. As I indicated last week, we have taken care to look at all the evidence currently available. Mr. Speaker, I can now share our assessment with the House. On the basis of the deep knowledge and analysis of our intelligence and weapons experts, the British government judges that the explosion was likely caused by a missile, or part of one, that was launched from within Gaza towards Israel. The misreporting of this incident had a negative effect in the region, including on a vital US diplomatic effort and on tensions here at home. We need to learn the lessons and ensure that in future there is no rush to judgment. Mr. Speaker, we have seen hate on our streets again this weekend. We all stand in solidarity with the Palestinian people. That is the message I brought to President Abbas. But we will never tolerate anti-Semitism in our country. Calls for jihad on our streets are not only a threat to the Jewish community, but to our democratic values. And we expect the police to take all necessary action to tackle extremism head-on. Mr. Speaker, this is a moment for great care and caution, but also for moral clarity. Hope and humanity must win out against the scourge of terrorism and aggression. The 7th of October attack was driven by hatred, but it was also driven by Hamas's fear that a new equilibrium might be emerging in the Middle East, one that would leave old divisions behind and offer hope of a better, more secure, more prosperous way forward. It is the same motivation that drives Putin's war on Ukraine, the fear of Ukraine's emergence as a modern, thriving democracy and the desire to pull it back into some imperialist fantasy of the past. Putin will fail, and so will Hamas. We must keep alive that vision of a better future against those who seek to destroy it. Together with our partners, that is what we will do, and I commend this statement to the House.
Keir Starmer, Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank the Prime Minister for an advance copy of his statement. The brutal attack in Israel just over 2 weeks ago was the darkest day in Jewish history since the Holocaust. 2 weeks of grief for the innocent people who lost brothers, sisters, children. 2 weeks of torture for the families whose loved ones were taken hostage by Hamas. There was a small glimmer of light this weekend, the release of 2 American hostages, Natalie and Judith Raanan. I met members of their family last week, and I know that they will be overcome with relief. But Hamas still hold hundreds more, sons, daughters, mums, dads, still missing, innocent people who could, if Hamas willed it, be released immediately. But they remain hostage because Hamas want the chaos of war. Hamas want Jews to suffer. Hamas want the Palestinian people to share in the pain because the Palestinian people are not their cause. Peace is not their aim. the dignity of human life, Jew or Muslim, means absolutely nothing to them. And in the light of their barbarism, Israel has the right to defend herself. Yes, to get their hostages home, but also to defeat Hamas, so nobody need suffer like this again. And that we might once more see a road to a lasting peace, a Palestinian state alongside a safe and secure Israel. And, Mr. Speaker, this operation can and must be done within international law. We democracies know that all human life is equal. Innocent lives must be protected. These are the principles that differentiate us from the terrorists who target Israel. So there must now be clear humanitarian corridors within Gaza for those escaping violence. Civilians must not be targeted. And where Palestinians are forced to flee, they must not be permanently displaced from their homes. International law is clear. It also means basic services, including water, electricity and fuel needed for it, cannot be denied. Hamas may not care for the safety and security of the Palestinian people, but we do. We cannot and will not close our eyes to their suffering. Gaza is now a humanitarian emergency. There is not enough food. Clean water is running out. Hospitals are going without medicine and electricity. People starving, reduced to drinking contaminated filth. Babies lying in incubators that could switch off at any moment. The deal struck by the United States to get a flow of trucks through the Rafah crossing is an important first step. 20 on Saturday, 14 on Sunday. But it's nowhere near enough. Gaza is not a small town facing a few shortages. It has a population the size of Greater Manchester, a place even before this devastation where life was a struggle. Gaza needs aid, and it needs to be rapid, safe, unhindered, and regular. Countries able to provide support must step up, including the United Kingdom. And so I welcome the increased funding for humanitarian aid that the Prime Minister has announced this afternoon. The EU has promised to treble humanitarian aid, and the US has appointed a special coordinator for international aid to Gaza. So I ask if the Prime Minister can commit to the same, because Britain must stand ready to ensure aid gets to the right places, to deploy British experts and medical support teams, and to work with international partners to give UN agencies the resources they need for the long term. Because, Mr. Speaker, there is a long term. Even as we stand by Israel in her fight against Hamas, our eyes must also look to the future, a future where Israeli citizens live free from the fear of terrorist attacks, and a future for the Palestinian people, where they and their children enjoy the freedoms and opportunities that we take for granted. For too long, we've talked about a two-state solution, the dignity and justice of a Palestinian state, alongside a safe and secure Israel, without a serious path or will to make it happen. And for too long, we have allowed welcome progress in improving relations between Israel and her neighbours to sit without any progress on the future for Palestine and its people. That must change. We stand with Israel and her right to defend herself against the terrorists of Hamas. We stand for international law, the protection of innocent lives, humanitarian support for the Palestinians. And we do so because we stand for a political path to a two-state solution and a better future. These are dark days, but the light must never go out. We must not let it. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And can I thank the Leader of the Opposition for his constructive comments and his support. Just to recap, on humanitarian aid, by announcing an additional £20 million today, we will be doubling our aid to the region, which is already one of the most leading contributions of any country in the world. My development minister will remind me, but I think around 10% of the UN mission in the region is funded by UK contributions. Most of our aid is funneled through them. It's also worth bearing in mind that President Sisi specifically commended the efforts of the UK alongside the US in ensuring that the Rafah crossing could be open and functioning, testament to the work of our team and the Development Minister and Foreign Secretary on the ground. I can also say, in response to the Leader of the Opposition's question with regard to the UN, that the Development Minister is in close contact on an almost daily basis with Martin Griffiths, the head of the UN's humanitarian relief efforts, to ensure that the UK can play a leading role in supporting what is happening on the ground. There are considerable logistical challenges in getting the aid to the people who need it, and those are areas where we can make a difference, particularly around El Arish, the logistical hub where supplies are moving to. And I can confirm that the Development Minister will tomorrow lay a written ministerial statement setting out further details of the increase in humanitarian aid that we've announced today. But in closing, Mr. Speaker, I concur with what the Leader of the Opposition said in my remarks earlier. There is absolutely a future available to us, which is a future more prosperous, more stable for people living in this region, where people can live with dignity, with security and with opportunity. That is the future that Hamas is trying to destroy, and we should stand united to stop that from happening.
Sir Julian Lewis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. From his discussions with Arab leaders, did my right honourable friend get any impression that they understood the purpose of Hamas terrorism to derail their efforts to find a better way of living in the Middle East? And was he satisfied?
So you heard the speech in the House of Commons, the statement actually from the Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, then the reply from the Leader of the Opposition Sir Keir Starmer, and then the Prime Minister reacting very positively to the supportive statement of Sir Keir. So let's talk to John Pienaar, who's going to be with us here on Times Radio from 5 o'clock, just reflecting on all that, I guess, John.
Yeah, and we'll be catching up with that with Kate McCann and talking to one of our correspondents in the area on the latest on the ground there. So a lot to catch up on. I mean, Rishi Sunak's statement was, I guess, pretty much as you'd expect, a formal restatement of support for Israel and the right of Israel to carry out its acts in the name of self-defence. And there was also something of a cautionary few words or a rebuke to news organisations after the attack on the El Ali hospital. And you heard the cheers behind him, with a rather rumble of support from Conservative MPs, which was, I suppose, with the BBC in particular in mind, because the BBC has had an awful lot of attention for the way that they reported the El Ali attack and immediately attributing that to Israel. Rishi Sunak today announced that the British review of the subject had taken some time longer than America's and the Pentagon's, but he'd come to the same conclusion.
Okay. We should say that the mood was just as sombre as it ever gets.
Indeed, it was. And the tone from the Leader of the Opposition was exactly the same as that of the Prime Minister, in favour of diplomacy. And
you couldn't get anything between them, could you? I mean, there was no clear blue water there at all. That's if you want it, by the way.
No, I'd say not significantly. I mean, Keir Starmer, he does emphasise, as do ministers when they're asked the question, the need for Israeli forces to show respect for the international law where it concerns human rights and restraint. What that actually means in practice is much, much more complicated. I mean, when you hear ministers pressed on this, they say they've got a right to self-defence, which is widely agreed. But how you interpret that at a time of siege and with missile strikes going on and large numbers of losses incurred by Palestinian civilians as well as, of course, by Israelis, I guess there's a debate.
But what is absolutely without doubt is that both Sir Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak mentioned repeatedly the suffering of the Palestinian people and made very clear that Hamas, they are a victim of Hamas too.
Yes.
They are not supporters necessarily of this terrorist organisation. They're not.
Which is where, I suppose, and just in that emphasis, it opens up the space for nuance or disagreement, and we got actually a great deal of both, because the siege of Gaza means, yes, I mean, I think 2 aid convoys have gone in now, with a certain amount of water, fuel and other supplies. But when you look at, a couple of million people in Gaza and a huge concentration of people at the southern Egypt border, that barely makes a dent. And so, look, will that be opened up more widely? At the moment, it's opened up very, very slowly. And Israel's answer to that is, look, we are at war with Hamas, and we don't want this stuff to get into the hands of Hamas gunmen, which, of course, you understand. But, of course, it is also the question which is in the grey area is the purpose of the siege. Of course, they don't want to get supplies into the hands of Hamas. Is it also about putting pressure on Palestinians to erode or destroy whatever support they have for Hamas?
I think it was Sir Keir Starmer who pointed out that Gaza has a population about the size of Greater Manchester.
Yeah,
which, and in a way, I actually welcome that kind of comparison, because it makes me, my understanding becomes slightly clearer when I get comparisons like that.
It is, and it's the most densely populated area on the planet in that way. So, the stories, the pictures we're seeing now every day of the losses of children on the Palestinian side, after the awful losses of children on the Israeli side, that's going to contribute maybe to, more focus on what's going on, but also maybe pressure on Israel as the operation goes on. They haven't even gone in on land war yet.
No, and we still don't know when that might occur. And now the theory is that the Americans are putting pressure on the Israelis not to do anything at all until the hostages are released.
Or pressure for a delay. So we've seen these airstrikes on what are described as Hamas infrastructure targets, which I'll discuss this on the show on Drive with, among others, correspondent on the ground, but also a British military commander. I think the assumption is these are tunnels, the sort of tunnels that Israel used forgive me, that Hamas used for their operations.
Yeah, okay. And we know that we are increasing our aid to the Palestinian people too. Yeah. Rishi Sunak made the claim that it was one of the biggest donations on earth, the donation from the UK. Yeah. So, I mean, whether that is enough to stop some critics of the British government's approach to this, I don't know. Is it a sizable amount of money, 20 million? Relatively speaking, is it?
Well, it is. It's a lot of money, but again, look at the size of the need, which is, as we say,
colossal.
It is colossal and getting worse every day.
Yeah. Okay. And what else would you draw attention to? I mean, it's interesting when Rishi Sunak detailed the people he'd met, the conversations he'd had, the Emir of Qatar, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, the President of Egypt, President Sisi, the Palestinian Authority. What influence can a British Prime Minister hope to wield in a crisis as potentially enormous as this?
I think I'd say, let's not overstate the direct purchasing power diplomatically of a British Prime Minister at a time like this. In recent history, Britain has had more power, influence than it has now. It's got a relationship with the Palestinians which goes back quite a long way, which has caused, in some ways, a little bit of suspicion on the Israeli side of Britain's involvement. What can Britain do? I guess it can join the effort to address the thing that leaders everywhere are worried about, and that is escalation. And as we look at the northern border of Israel, and we're now seeing some engagements there with Hezbollah, and we had that report of missiles, cruise missiles and drones coming through down the coast there from Yemen, where the Houthis are the other group there, and they are under the influence of Iran as well. The worry is that gets out of control in a very serious way.
John Pienaar will be with you here on Times Radio from 5 o'clock, John, there, just reflecting on the statement in the House of Commons from the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak. And then, of course, there was a response, a very supportive response from Sir Keir Starmer, the leader of the Labour Party, which you also heard live on Times Radio. We will go to a reporter in Israel in a moment or two. I should just say that in the next hour of the programme, there will be other stories covered. There are other things going on. It's quite a big story. The moon is a lot older than any of us realised. We'll talk about that.